NATO's summit in Bucharest portrays the alliance as deeply divided on most issues. But it's Afghanistan that is a crucial test to the alliance's credibility. Just what price should NATO pay in order to make the mission succeed? This is Inside Story. Hello, I'm Imran Garda. The summit in Bucharest this week is the largest in NATO's history. More than 50 heads of state have converged on Romania's capital. It's to be the last ever NATO summit attended by George Bush as US president. And Russia's President Vladimir Putin is expected to arrive on Friday for his first ever visit to a NATO summit. Well, expanding the membership has been high on the agenda, but Macedonia's entry was blocked by Greece, and bids by former Russian bloc nations Ukraine and Georgia have been shelved. NATO was founded almost 60 years ago, and critics are calling for a complete overhaul for the organization. While internal divisions are emerging at the summit, more than anywhere else, it's Afghanistan where those divisions are playing out. Well, NATO's commanded the International Security Assistance Force in Afghanistan since 2003, and NATO's work there is its first mission outside the Euro-Atlantic area. NATO's Afghan mission is to provide security and help with reconstruction. It currently leads more than 40,000 troops in the country. The majority of those are American. Canadian forces are deployed in the south. That's one of Afghanistan's most inhospitable areas, and their casualty figures are rising. Canada has threatened to pull out forces unless other countries are prepared to commit more troops. But on Wednesday, France said it will send around 1,000 extra troops to reinforce NATO's presence. Well, US President George Bush has urged NATO members to contribute more forces to the mission in Afghanistan, and he stressed why he thinks it's important.
Nations need to take this mission seriously because it's in our mutual interests. It's in our interest, of course, to help young democracies survive. But in this case, it's in our interest to help succeed because we don't want an enemy that has been known to attack people, nations in our alliance, to be able to develop safe haven again, to be able to use a launching pad like Afghanistan to plot, plan, and attack. So this is a vital mission, and it's hard work. It's a tough mission.
Well, joining our discussion today are our guests. In Kabul, Mullah Abdussalam Zaif, former Taliban ambassador in Pakistan and former Guantanamo Bay detainee. Also in Kabul, Mark Lytle, NATO civilian spokesman in Afghanistan. And in Washington, D.C., Thomas Donnelly, a fellow at the American Enterprise Institute and a former deputy director of the Project for the New American Century. Gentlemen, welcome to the program. Mr. Lytle, if I could start off with you. President Bush has made a strong appeal for NATO members to make a bigger contribution. Do you think NATO members are listening?
Yes, I think they are to a large degree. I think we're seeing at the summit now an increase in contributions, which certainly goes a significant way to meeting the gaps that there are. I think it's a little too early to be sure what gaps are left, but I think there are extra contributions, and I think importantly we're seeing very strong statements of commitment for the long haul. It's not just about adding extra troops, it's about being prepared to be in Afghanistan long enough to actually finish the job, and I think that is what's coming over. As you were mentioning at the beginning, this is the largest summit in NATO's history, and you're seeing a whole lot of nations lining up, and I think it's easy to forget, while you argue about how many extra troops, in just a couple of years, we've gone from 5,000 troops to 47,000. There's now a couple of thousand more, and a lot of those troops are going into the toughest areas. So I think, yes, there is a strong commitment there, and a strong commitment for the long haul, which is what the Afghan people need to be sure that they're going to have the help over the long haul that can give them the confidence to back their government.
Well, you'll be familiar with the name General James Jones, formerly NATO's Supreme Commander. He was quoted in The Economist as saying, quote, "Make no mistake, NATO is not winning in Afghanistan." Why do you think he said that?
Well, in fact, as you say, I do know General Jones. I used to work for him. The statement was in a press release It wasn't really a fair representation of what he said. He did, though, to be fair, he highlighted significant challenges. I think what has happened over the last couple of years is that the situation was tougher, more challenging than people expected. And what's happening is NATO's having to raise its game. And in many respects, I would say NATO is raising its game. The toughest area, as everyone will know, is in the Regional Command South, the heart of the insurgency. And there, in 18 months, we've gone from 9,500 troops supplied by 11 nations to 17,500 troops, almost doubled from 17 nations. Now we've got another 3,000 troops coming in from the Marines. We've seen that the French have promised another battalion battle group. And so I think you're seeing people stepping up to the plate. Is it enough? I think that's for others to argue. But it's certainly more than there was, and I think there is that realization that we've got to keep doing more. But I'd also make the argument very strongly, it's not just about troops. To succeed in Afghanistan, it's a combination of security, which is mainly NATO and the Afghans, and the Afghan army, but also reconstruction, development and governance. The whole world needs to step up to the plate to make sure that you have this comprehensive approach, which is what you need to succeed. It's not just fighting, it's about giving Afghans jobs, it's about uncorrupt government which is efficient, it's about policemen and so on. So this is a job for everyone, it's not just a job for NATO, and NATO alone can't succeed. As part of a team, it certainly can.
Mullah Zaif, let's bring you in here in Kabul. We're listening to Mr. Lytle. He's talking about the successes of NATO in Afghanistan, and he's quite optimistic. I'm assuming you would disagree.
I think the succeeding of NATO in Afghanistan, if its purpose to bring peace and stability to the country, still the country is stabilized. And the people of Afghanistan, they are not happy with their activities in Afghanistan. Still, they are fighting with the Afghanis people in Afghanistan. They are bombing the houses, and they are killing the people. They are capturing the people. If you go to the prisons of NATO, American, ISAF, you should see all the prisons, they are full of people. And still, it is not happiness with the people of Afghanistan. And the people of Afghanistan, they are concerned about the future of Afghanistan, what is happening. If you see the NATO force in Afghanistan, inside the city or somewhere in the road, how they are doing how they are going somewhere. And the people there are fear from NATO soldiers, and the people they don't want to see them. And if some people they are coming near to them, they are shooting them. And every day, that's the dozens of people they are killing by their activities. I think the priority for the people of Afghanistan is security and stability. The stability and security is not coming just by force, to using force to capture the people, to kill the people. I think the hateness of people increased in Afghanistan, and the complaining of the people increased in Afghanistan. And always, if you're listening to the people of Afghanistan, they are crying, they are making complaint from NATO in ISAF, in American and Afghanistan. I think they are not succeed in Afghanistan, but in this kind of activities, in this kind of action in Afghanistan, they should lose what they want in Afghanistan.
All right, Mullah Zaif, we will go into this issue of the loss of civilian lives in Afghanistan a little bit later on, but I want to bring in Mr. Donnelly now. Mr. Donnelly, these caveats or these issues that NATO members have in not wanting to contribute more, or for being slightly skeptical with the US and other members, do they have valid concerns for not wanting to beef up the presence in Afghanistan?
Well, you mentioned the question of caveats, which is a separate one from the force levels. I'd say there are two very distinct issues. One is the overall number, but the second is which contingents, which NATO contingents are doing what. For example, the German contingent, which is pretty sizable, is deployed in the north of Afghanistan and the border areas, say, where the population is mostly Uzbek or Tajik. And it's relatively peaceful there, and their kinds of missions are more traditional stabilization, peacekeeping, reconstruction kinds of missions. As you mentioned earlier in the program, and as Mark mentioned, in the southern provinces, particularly Kandahar and Helmand, where the Canadian contingent is and the British contingent is, and where the U.S. Marines are about to deploy, that's the sort of central part of the Pashtun belt, so-called, in Afghanistan, and that's where the majority of the violence is. So there are two separate issues. The Germans seem perfectly willing to continue to contribute with the restrictions that they've adopted, but I don't think it's likely that they would volunteer to redeploy to the southern provinces. So this is a very complex juggling act that NATO has to undertake in order to make progress. But as Mark suggested, actually there is a lot of progress being made.
Mr. Donnelly, Russia is at this NATO summit. Do you think Russia is being a hindrance in terms of NATO and Afghanistan?
I don't think Russia is playing very much of a role at all in regard to Afghanistan. Certainly not through NATO. And the factors that are destabilizing Afghanistan, or the outside countries that are contributing to instability in Afghanistan, tend to either be Iran or Taliban or al-Qaeda inspired groups that come across the border from Pakistan. So I'd say Russia's role is actually quite low when it comes to Afghanistan, despite the Soviet past history there.
Mullah Zaev, do you see NATO simply as an occupying force in Afghanistan?
They are increasing the number of troops to Afghanistan, and they want to force and to continue the fighting with the Taliban. Sometimes they are condemning the Pakistan, sometimes they are condemning Iran and other neighbors. But the problem is inside of Afghanistan. You know, in the Pakistan, that's the problem. By the negative activities of Pakistan or possession of Pakistan increased, the problem inside Pakistan. And if the Iran starting the same, following the same policy like the NATO or American want, it will be increase the problem inside the Iran. The mainly issue, the people in the neighbor in this area, they are concerned about truth. Increasing the truth of the NATO, that's meaning they are unsuccessful in Afghanistan, and they are not able to bring peace and stability. And that's meaning they are increasing the number of troops, or they are complaining from their friend inside of Afghanistan. But the mainly issue for peace and stability, they must to change the policy, and they must to change their attitude in Afghanistan, and they must to leave the people of Afghanistan freely to decide for the problem of Afghanistan. By foreign troops, by foreign people in Afghanistan, they are not able to solve the issue of Afghanistan. The Afghanistan issue belongs with the people of Afghanistan, and the people of Afghanistan, they are able to bring peace and stability and reconciliation to Afghanistan. I think this is the issue, and the NATO and other foreigners, they must to focus in this issue, and they will give chance to the people of Afghanistan.
Well, the start of spring in Afghanistan always signals more al-Qaeda and Taliban attacks on international forces. This year, spring has come early, and March saw more fighting than March last year, up more than 20% according to some statistics. In a report last month, UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon said militant attacks in Afghanistan increased dramatically in 2007. He acknowledged that the Taliban and related armed groups represent fundamental threats to the country's institutions. Mohammed Val has more on the preparations by Taliban fighters to carry out more attacks in Afghanistan.
preaching holy war in a Taliban mosque, and a suicide bomber awaiting the go-ahead. This is a deliberate show of force by the Taliban. Now that the winter snows have cleared, they are regrouping. And they say they're operating in many parts of the country, especially in the south. Riding on motorcycles or toting weapons, some of which from the Soviet era, their humble means do not seem to match their strong resolve.
Since the beginning of spring, we destroy many enemy tanks and demolish 4 police and National Army checkpoints. The morale of our mujahideen is high. We have 6 suicide bombers ready at any time. And until the last drop of our blood, we will sacrifice for Islam.
Al Jazeera camera has captured this slice of Taliban's life in the region of Ghazni, south of Kabul. In full control of large parts of the rural area, they are here enjoying some free time. This is a martial art in keeping with early Muslim society traditions. But for the Taliban, it's also a preparation for battle.
I'm doing jihad as a religious obligation and will continue to fight the enemy till they leave Afghanistan or till my last breath. The infidels have occupied my land and I'm going to free my country.
Last week, the Taliban leaders announced a new operation which they named Iprat, or lesson. They vowed to make an example of the foreign troops in Afghanistan, using both old and new tactics. Their attacks so far, however, have been less deadly than this time last year. And the new fighting techniques they threatened to use are not demonstrated yet. As the NATO countries whose troops are stationed in Afghanistan say they will continue fighting the Taliban say they are determined to resist. The Taliban are often considered to be made up of youth from Quranic schools. But these 60 to 70-year-old men could be seen as a new generation in this movement. Their joining the insurgency might signal an increase in Taliban's appeal among some village communities. This may just be a symbolic sight, but it does epitomize the plight of the people of a country whose history is steeped in conflict. Mohammed Val, Al Jazeera, Afghanistan.
Mullah Zaif, you would have heard that report over there. Is the Taliban preparing for a fresh spring offensive?
Yes, I think they are making pressure in the spring season, and the spring season is coming. They are increasing the number of attacks because this is 2 reasons. One, the weather become warm and hot for them. It is easy for them to live everywhere, and they can go everywhere very easily. No cold and no problem of snow. And the second issue is there is everything become green, and they can go and sit everywhere under shadow. And there's 2 reasons they are increasing. And during jihad time against the Russian invasion, it was the same tactic the Mujahideen was doing, and they were increasing the number of increasing from spring until winter.
And Mullah Zaif, sorry to interrupt you. Mullah Zaif, are you concerned that a lot of the time, particularly with these suicide attacks, that many civilians die, many innocent Afghan civilians who the Taliban says they are defending? And I think every part of the fighting, they must be care about the civilian casualty. If they are Taliban or government or NATO, and they must care. If the Taliban they are doing everything, but they must to target the enemy, and they must to take care about the civilian casualty. I know that every time when the NATO they are attacking on Taliban, the victim is the majority they are civilians people. All right, sorry to interrupt you. Let me pose this to Mr. Laity. Mr. Laity, let's talk about hearts and minds for a second, because many feel that there's a trend of impunity when it comes to NATO, that maybe you don't realize that NATO's reputation will always seem to be dwindling in the eyes of the Afghan population when scores of civilians die during NATO operations. We saw even Hamid Karzai about a year ago appealing to coalition forces that enough was enough, that they needed to be more careful? Is this a big problem?
Well, I think, let me say very clearly, there is no impunity for NATO forces, for ISAF forces, when civilian casualties result from our actions. We have very strict rules about when we can and when we cannot open fire. And there were a series of incidents, tragic incidents in the middle of last year, which made us review our own procedures. And since then, we've seen quite dramatic improvements, over a reduction of over a half in the number of incidents. And every time civilian casualties result from our actions, we have a series of reports and we examine it to make sure that we did the right thing and what we need to do to try and prevent it happening again. I think one of the things that people should be aware of is it is now an absolute standard tactic by the Taliban to claim that their deaths are in fact civilians. And time again what we're having is where we are having carefully targeted strikes which kill Taliban or other opposition, and there are no collateral damage whatsoever, and the Taliban spokesman will get on the phone and call people and say, oh no, they weren't Taliban, they were civilians.
All right, let me bring in Mr. Donnelly. Sorry to interrupt you. I want to bring in Mr. Donnelly. From your point of view, what's the price of failure in Afghanistan?
Well, I think it was captured very clearly by the clip from President Bush you broadcast earlier. And we know what will happen and what did happen in Afghanistan when the Taliban were in charge, or even when there was a civil war prior to the Taliban assuming control in Kabul. And the cocoon that's provided for international terrorism by a Taliban-like state is unacceptable to the rest of the world.
Mr. Donnelly, do you think that the chaos of Iraq, sorry to interrupt you, do you think the chaos of Iraq after the invasion of Afghanistan has contributed to Afghanistan's instability in recent years?
No, I think what's going on in Afghanistan is a very local phenomenon. I would again stress that there are many communities in Afghanistan, the Tajiks, the Uzbek, the Hazara, for example, who really have no interest in returning to Taliban Pashtun rule. So really the question in Afghanistan, the question for NATO, is whether, first of all, the southern provinces can be decently governed from Kabul, and that security provided by the government and development provided by the government and structured by the government can take root there. So even if the pace of progress is not what we wish it were, we have to better define what the goal is, and I think that's eminently achievable. Has nothing to do with Iraq, and even has less to do with al-Qaeda per se. The strictly speaking al-Qaeda influence inside Afghanistan is really quite minimal.
All right, Mr. Donnelly, I'm going to have to interrupt you. I'm really
these Taliban
sorry.
questions are very local.
We've reached the end of the program. Mr. Mullah Zaif, Mark Lytle and Thomas Donnelly, thank you very much, all of you, for joining us on this edition of Inside Story. And thank you so much, the viewer. We'll see you soon.